Termo to Madeline, Audio Edition, page 62, chapter titled The Lynching, A Mystery Still. The whereabouts of people on the Madeline Plains and a few South Fork ranchers on the night of January 23, 1886, is difficult to trace. It is similarly difficult to determine exactly what the various members of the Masonic Lodge were doing beyond a given point. Then there are those who may have simply wanted to know the whole truth. Not only do we not know where they were, it is impossible to even guess who they were. Members of these three groups became even harder to trace when it is realized that some of them used every means available to cover their tracks. One individual who fit into two and possibly three of the groups will have to tell the story for all, since, if he told the whole truth, his whereabouts can be traced for the whole evening. Willis Brockman was definitely in Susanville on the night of January 23rd. The only rancher from up north who can definitely be said to have been in Susanville near this date was George H. Bailey. He had made a quick visit there just 10 days before, a rather long time previous to the date in question, and yet close enough to cause some to believe he was the instigator. To get back to Willis Brockman's story, he was in town for installation of officers at the Masonic Lodge. In fact, his father, William Brockman, was one of the officers taking office that night. When the ceremony was over, the members and their families partook of a bountiful repast, according to the Advocate reporter. Afterwards, those who felt so inclined attended a dance which was being held at the New Johnson and Hall Hotel. Willis Brockman was one of those who went dancing. It was there that the word was brought by an exasperated runner that something horrible had just occurred over at the jailhouse. Willis, along with others of the group at the hotel, made their way hurriedly to the site. There in the woodshed behind the courthouse and adjoining the jail was a ghastly spectacle, never to be forgotten by those who saw it. In fact, it soon had the entire town of Susanville in a high-pitched uproar. Traffic moved rapidly in and out of the area. Those coming to see and those hastily leaving muttered in horror and disgust. For there in the woodshed, hanging lifelessly, was the bodies of two men, Holden Dick, Sam Shaw's murderer, and Vincent Olivas, commonly called Mexican Ben, convicted just last week of the murder of Griffith Logan near Pittville. Ben's body was naked from the waist down, his pants hanging loosely around his shoeless feet. He was hanging by the well-broken neck from a rope that crossed over the woodshed's crossbeam and was tied off at the upright post. On his throat were deep finger marks indicating he had evidently been choked into submission as he was dragged from his cell. Dick's body presented a spectacle gruesome beyond description. His neck was also broken, but his clothing was ripped and torn, and his entire upper body and face were covered with drying blood. His scalp hung loosely to one side of his head. He had been strung up first by his long black hair in the ensuing struggle. The weight of his body had completely torn his scalp loose. Even with a fracas like that, the only things that residents living near the jail heard were a couple of loud cries and a pistol shot. As people walked away from the scene, talking to each other in muffled tones, many of them were sure that this torture had been applied to Dick Holden to obtain a confession from him to who had hired him to kill Shaw. Further investigation at the site of the lynching revealed that the mob responsible for the crime had forced their way into the jail by means of bar and sledgehammer. But after the locks were broken off, they were carried away, never to be seen again. A quick check of the 3 sets of keys that fit the locks in the jail soon revealed that the mob had not been in possession of any of them. Susanville's night watchman had his set in his pocket far from the hanging. Sheriff Leakey had once sat with him at the same dance Willis Brockman had been attending at the Johnson house. The third set was locked in a drawer in the sheriff's office in the courthouse, and from all appearances no one had entered the locked office. The next day was Sunday. The bodies of the 2 dead men were cut down and placed in coffins. On Monday, Mexican Ben was buried in Susanville, and a band of Pit River Indians came and took the body of Holden Dick, carrying it away to be buried according to Indian custom. And thus another mystery had developed in the case of Holden Dick. Again rumors spread like wildfire as to who the perpetrators of the deed were. Theories were many, the main ones of which can still be heard today. These theories, starting with who hired Dick Holden, will be examined here. However, the reader is to be reminded that these are only theory, legend, and speculation, and that the court's civil authorities and the author have drawn no conclusions from any of them. The reader will have to draw his own conclusions. The author, stating only the pros and the cons of various accusations that have been put forth over the years. Most every South Fork rancher and several Madeline plains of that era have been accused at one time or another of having hired Holden Dick. There are 2 who have stood out above all the rest. First, of James G. Looper. He is the one who was supposed to have filed on Shaw's Spring to begin with. He was the one who received a severe red dress from his boss, George H. Bailey. He was suspicioned so highly as to be arrested at the time of the killing. He left the area shortly afterwards, and no one heard anything about him until just 11 days before Holden Dick's trial. At that time in Pennsylvania, the Philadelphia Times ran an article saying Looper had been picked up there under the alias of John Slocum by a Modoc County deputy. Looper was located a couple of weeks later in Reno, where he had just arrived from his home state of Arkansas. He claimed he had not been any farther east than that, and that they knew nothing of the reports that had been arrested for the hiring of Dick Holden. Off and on over the next couple of years, Looper's name was brought up again and again by various parties who felt he should be prosecuted for the hiring of Shaw's murderer. Then, just 2 years after Holden Dick's lynching, on March 16, 1888, Jim Looper committed suicide in Susanville by taking an overdose of opiate. This greatly received the story of his involvement in the case. He was known to be a drug user, and it became obvious to some that he had hired Dick Holden in a narcotic-induced stupor to kill Jim Shaw, the man who had caused him the trouble with his boss. Then, as time progressed and his conscience became more scarring, he could stand it no longer and took his own life with the same drug that supposedly had brought about Shaw's death in the first place. Much evidence points towards James Looper as the individual who hired the killer of Shaw, but there is one very substantial piece of evidence that points exactly away from him. Why, if he hired the killer, was poor old Sam Shaw's head found in West Valley? Had Holden Dick carried the head up to the Marsh place to show it to Looper, then it could have afterwards been easily disposed of in any number of places, including the mud on the lower part of the Marsh place. Why would Holden Dick have packed the grisly thing all those miles to South Fork? And this brings up the most prominent of theories. If the man who hired the killer was a South Fork rancher, to whom does most of the evidence point, George Bailey, of course, he owned the Marsh place at the time of the killing. It was he who wanted to control and to have the possession of the springs that Shaw had filed on. And, of course, it was he whose headquarters was on the South Fork of the Pit River. However, those who knew George Bailey well find this idea impossible to believe. Nowhere in Lassen and Modoc counties was there a better-liked individual, an individual respected and loved by small ranchers and large operators alike. George Bailey was well known for helping the little man, not harassing or killing him. At various times he had even taken poor men into partnership. He always benefited from these contracts, but so did they. George Bailey was not known as a ruffian, as was James Luber. In fact, far from it. He was known for his refinement. He often quoted Shakespeare and had a deep love for literature and the arts. And really, one spring more or less could not have meant that much to one of the largest landholders in Lassen and Modoc counties. Certainly, one would think it would not be worth the commission of murder to a man of George Bailey's stature. But someone still lynched Holden Dick, or again hired it to be done, for some reason, and why? A man condemned to hang anyway certainly did not need lynching. The main theory again points to an accusing finger at George Bailey and other South Fork ranchers as being responsible for the lynching in order to prevent Dick from talking. And a plausible idea this is, except why did they wait almost a year after the conviction when they could have silenced him much sooner and taken many less chances? Indeed, Holden Dick could easily have been silenced even before the trial ever took place. George Bailey was in Susanville shortly before the hanging and could have organized a lynching party, but, as large a rancher as he was, he could also have easily been there on most any other kind of legitimate business as well. Now, a second theory involves the Susanville Masons, and it looks reasonable enough when one considers that most of those who made up the exterminators group of previous years were Masons and were sworn to killing Indians. It looks reasonable when one considers that Sam Shaw was a very active Mason and the lynching could have been accomplished as a means of revenge. But again, why did they wait so long after the trial? And if the guilty parties were Masons, it had to be only a select few, because most of them were at the dance at the Johnson house that night. The final and most probable theory says that the lynchers were the people who wanted to know who the hired killer was working for. They had merely been trying to get a confession from Dick before stringing him up for the last time. And this could seem reasonable considering that Holden Dick was first hung by his hair. It would seem that anyone would break down and tell who had hired them as they hung helplessly by the hair. In excruciating pain, hanging from the ceiling. Anyone, that is, except Holden Dick. All he did was leave a complete and baffling mystery for people to ponder down through the ages. Next chapter, titled Brockmans, a breeder of fine horses. William Brockman was one of the early pioneers to Lassen County, having come to Susanville in 1864. He was a blacksmith and a wagon maker by trade. At that time, he was also a bachelor. Available women were in short supply in Lassen County, and Bill Brockman may have stayed a single man longer if the Indians had not killed Charlie League in 1867. Making a widow of his wife Alice. William Brockman married her a couple of years later and even got a stepson, Frank League. Bill and Alice became the parents of two sons, Willis and Fritz, before Alice's ultimate death. Bill married again a few years later and became the father of three more children, Charlie, Edna, and Lizzie. Of all these 5 children, 6 including Frank League, Willis was the only one who could be happy on the Madeline Plains. When Willis was a young boy, his father had a horse camp on the west side of Eagle Lake. Willis grew up running horses and camping on the property at Eagle Lake. This was not good breeding grounds for horses, however, and that is what Brockman was running there, his brood mares. Bill Brockman was as progressive a horse raiser as there was, but he would lose a large percentage of his colts at Eagle Lake each year. The theory was that the horses ate too many pine needles in the forested area there, and the turpentine in them caused the mares to abort their fowls. William Brockman was a breeder of quality Percheron draft horses. He hated race horses with a passion, and had only enough saddle horses to properly handle his purebreds. Like Elmer Van Loan, with his purebred Shires, Brockman imported the finest Percheron stallions that could be found in the United States, France, and England. It just would not do for a prominent horseman like William Brockman to be losing so many colts. So he let the place at Eagle Lake go and went looking for a better location to breed his mares. Actually, it was Willis, who was 17 years old at the time, who went searching. He drove about 100 mares up into Madeline Plains that year and camped with them all summer on Van Loan Creek, about a mile above the Van Loan stage station. He returned to Susanville in the fall to winter the horses and to set up a precedent that would last for the next 20 years or so. The following year, a 40-acre piece of preemption ground was filed on, and Willis put up a cabin, barn, and small corral on the site. That and each consecutive spring, Willis drove the mares and stallions up country out of Susanville to the horse camp at Madeline. It generally took at least 3 days to get to Park's place, a couple of miles north of where Termo is today. The route that was followed went out to Willow Creek from Susanville, then up to Horse Lake, and finally on over to where the Parks brothers, Samuel and Haskell, had recently settled. Because of the great weight of the heavy Percheron horses, Willis usually laid over there a few days to let them rest. Then it would take him another day to move them on up to the horse camp. Since the horses were so heavy, it was necessary to shoe them before they ever left Susanville. Otherwise, they would have been so sore-footed by the time they reached Willow Creek that all progress northward would have stopped. Then, of course, before coming home in the fall, it was necessary to put shoes on the entire band again. Since William Brockman was a blacksmith, this job fell to him, while his sons took care of all the rest of the ranch work. As the years went along, the Brockmans expanded their outfit into one of the larger ones on the Madeline Plains, and eventually even turned it into an independent unit. They did, however, continue to move large numbers of horses, and later cattle, back and forth between Susanville and McDonald Mountain. They bought the Moyers preemption claim in time, and Willis eventually made his headquarters there at what was to become known as Brockman. They bought more preemption land and took up over 1,000 acres of swamp and overflow land on the flat below Brockman at Lanning Springs and Skeleton Flat, and where the Mendaburo Reservoir is today. They also bought the Parks brothers out. Shortly after the turn of the century, they were to control 8,860 acres of deeded land between Brockman's and Van Loan's. All of the water on the north and west of McDonald Peak was on deeded land. As the place expanded, the procedures for running livestock changed. The swamp and overflow ground on the flat was fenced and used for breeding pastures for the Percheron mares. All their horses and their several hundred head of cattle were run on the other property and on the open range. They only kept the amount of cattle on hand during the winter that they had hay for. The rest was driven to Honey Lake, where William Brockman had ranched at Susanville and Milford. The horses to be sold and the stallions were all taken to Honey Lake too. The drys and other horses that were not to be sold were wintered at Parks Canyon and Three Peaks. Every year at haying time, all the 4-year-old colts were gotten in and broke to work. They were taught to walk and not run, and were used to put up the poor quality, quote, wind pudding, hay, that grew on the flat below Brockman. Then, when they were taken to Susanville in the fall, they would be fed out and fattened up just like steers. In the spring, they would be driven to San Francisco and sold at matched pairs. Some of Brockman's pretty sorrel coats with flaxy manes and tails were brought the top price in the country. Many Brockman's horses were soon be working in the rice fields around Gridley and Briggs, California, each summer. Willis Brockman was lucky in all the years that he took horses and cattle back and forth between Honey Lake and Madeline. He never got caught in a snowstorm that was bad enough to cause the loss of any stock. People living in Horse Lake, however, always knew when the first big snowstorm of the winter was coming, right after Willis Brockman went through with his cattle. Willis also raised a family native to the Madeline Plains. He married William and Isabel Mayer's oldest daughter. Her name was Mary Isabel, but everyone knew her as Molly. It was about this time that Brockman brought the Moyers' preemption claim, and Willis and Molly set up housekeeping at Brockman. By this time, the Mowers had moved their headquarters off their timber claim and had built a house at what would later be called Brockman. But because Mrs. Mower was in poor health, they moved out and went to Yuba City, California, and their daughter and son-in-law moved in. Willis Brockman and Molly Brockman soon had a family, and, with the growing numbers in both his family and the hired help, Willis found himself making more trips to and from Susanville for groceries and supplies. Where a couple of pack horses laden with supplies used to keep him going for a summer, Willis now had to hitch up 8 head of his fine Percheon to couple the freight wagons to haul enough supplies to Madeline for the year. There was one thing about it, though. Willis soon had a lot of help with his buckarooing. He and Molly had 5 children, but their first son died at birth, and their only daughter, Mildred Lenora, died when she was only 22 months old. Willis and Molly's other 3 sons, William, Emmett, and Lester, all grew up helping their father on the ranch. Next chapter, The Corporation, page 79.